Hello and welcome to this lecture on the coastal Indians or the coastal Native Americans. This is our first look at more contemporary Native American cultures that you find in the Pacific Northwest. As such, we need to spend the first few minutes of this lecture exploring some terms, some terminology, and then also some caveating to make sure that I provide the appropriate context for our conversations and for the terminology that we will be using. The first thing I want to be clear is that this is not going to be the sole conversation we have about the indigenous native peoples of the Pacific Northwest. Too often in teaching American or North American history, what we have done, and this academics have been guilty of this, the general public has been guilty of this. It's a wide a group of people who bear responsibility for this approach. But typically, what happens is we talk about indigenous cultures in the past and don't continue their stories up to the present and talk about them, including to this day. That is wrong. That is not respective or respectful of the history and historical experience. And it marginalizes Native peoples as if they only exist in the past and they don't exist today. This is our first conversation. This is our conversation broadly, and I do mean broadly, talking about Native and Indigenous cultures that you find in the Pacific Northwest. It's simply to introduce you, broadly speaking, to the customs, commonalities, and differences you find amongst groups within the Pacific Northwest, specifically within the state of Washington. So we'll be talking about them in the broadest sense in our first introduction here. But make no mistake, this is not the totality of our conversation, and I don't want to leave you with that impression. The first half of this course is really about the relationship between indigenous cultures and Europeans and Americans who came in first as trading partners and later as groups who were determined to dispossess native peoples of the lands upon which they lived throughout history. And this is something really important that you need to understand. If you live on North American soil, you are living on land that belonged to one of the indigenous peoples of North America, and they were dispossessed of it, possibly by disease, possibly by warfare, possibly by governmental policy that removed them. There are a whole host of ways it happened, but indigenous peoples were removed from their lands. And everyone who lives in North America is on land that was the ancestral homelands of indigenous groups, of single tribes, of multiple tribes. And it's important that you appreciate and understand that. But the first half of this story is really, the first half of this class is really that story. The understanding indigenous cultures and then their relationships with those who came from outside, and how those who came from outside, the Americans, the Europeans, began to dispossess them of their ancestral homelands. And in the second half of this class, among the many topics we will be covering in the second half of this class, is how people who were dispossessed further found themselves marginalized, found themselves the target for violence that was genocidal, found their cultures and languages and way of lives subject to eradication, which was a cultural genocide, and how those peoples developed strategies to adapt and cope with those conditions, and then how they survived and what contemporary expressions of their culture exist today and what their lives are like today, and so on and so forth. So this is the start of a conversation that I want you to be aware of, okay? The other thing I want you to be aware of is that you're going to hear me use various terms and terminology. Very often in these lectures, you're going to hear me use Native American or Indian or indigenous cultures, or you're going to hear me refer to specific tribes by name, like Makah or Nez Perce or Spokane or so on and so forth. I want you to be aware that the terms we use are both historical and interchangeable and also culturally sensitive. In the primary source record, you will often see the term Indian used. Now, the term Indian comes from the age of exploration, when Columbus, intending to reach China, as we'll talk about in a subsequent lecture, actually ended up reaching the Americas. But he didn't understand that initially, so he thought he'd reach India and thus labeled the indigenous people Indians. And even after it was well understood that these peoples were not the people of South Asia, the name Indian stuck. In the 20th century, it became more common to refer to them as Native Americans. That term you'll hear me use a lot, and that's a term you find in a lot of the literature and even among indigenous peoples today, Native American or native culture, native peoples. But of course, that term has its own issues with specificity, because of course, the term America is a little bit, a little bit opaque, and Native American may or may not be accurate from the perspective of some indigenous peoples. And so you've seen recently among academics and scholars, and even among Native American communities, the use of, indigenous Americans, and the term indigenous being the original people who were on these lands, right? And then, of course, because these lands were labeled America, they're indigenous Americans. You'll also hear the term American Indian, right? And you'll hear Native American still. So I will be using those terms interchangeably. When you do exams or you write papers in this class, I'm not concerned whether you use Indian or Native American or Native people or indigenous Americans or indigenous cultures or some, combination thereof, so long as you are using the term with the respect that indigenous peoples deserve. I'm not bothered by terminology. If you spend time around indigenous communities, in a previous life, I had a job that encouraged and required me to spend time on reservations across the Pacific Northwest and really across the American West. And in doing so, I often found that indigenous peoples themselves often just use the term Indian, broadly speaking, to describe themselves, if they're not using their tribal and band affiliation. So any term that you use among the ones I've mentioned that is used with respect and an attempt at accuracy is fine by me. But I wanted to clear up some of that just a little bit, okay? With those caveats and context established, let's begin the content of this lecture, which is a discussion of the coastal Indians. But before we do that, we need to sort of figure out what we mean by the term coastal Indians or coastal Native American communities. Scholars, when they study groups of people throughout the world, they often develop categories for understanding time periods and peoples and societies and civilizations. Oftentimes these categories that are created are academically useful, but not necessarily rooted in the everyday lived experience of the peoples and the cultures that they're describing. And the reason I bring that up is that when scholars studied the indigenous peoples of North America, they quickly realized that although they were individual tribes, most famously like, the academics will often refer to these as the 500 nations, because there were at least 500 distinguishable tribes in North America, um, as sort of like the onslaught of westward expansion and colonialism hit native peoples. But an accurate counting of these indigenous tribes will never be known, just because of what happened in history. So they're often, but when you look at these like 500 nations or these tribal groups that are spread throughout the country, what became obvious is, even though they were all culturally distinct with their own unique identities, that geographically they kind of fell into what were labeled culture groups. And these culture groups were effectively tribes who lived in regions who practiced a similar culture, right? They practiced similar ways of life. It didn't mean they were identical, and it didn't mean they weren't unique peoples with their own languages and customs and so on and so forth, because they certainly were, but they fell into cultural groups, right? And in the Pacific Northwest, which is what we're talking about right now, what you had were two distinct culture groups that were found here. One was called the Northwest Coast, or the Coastal Indians, and the other was called the Plateau, or the Plateau Indians, right? And within those culture areas, once again, to emphasize terms used by academics, there were individual tribes, but there were enough similarities that you could broadly speak about these individual tribes. So that's what we're going to do in this lecture, is talk about one of these culture groups, the Coastal Indians, right? The Northwest Coast, but what is more commonly referred to as the Coastal Indians, right? We're going to talk broadly about their culture, and then as we move through the course, we'll be talking about very specific tribes. So let's begin. Let's first start by thinking about the geography of the Northwest Coastal Indians, or the Coastal Indians. This is geographically an area that stretches from southern Alaska all the way to the border between Oregon and California today, largely hugging the coastal areas and including the islands. If you look on the map of the area shaded in pink, what we're talking about here is an area that largely hugs the coast and the major water bodies, and doesn't extend any inland further than the mountain range, whether it's the coastal mountains in Canada and Oregon, or the Cascade Mountains in Washington and other parts of Oregon. So from a location perspective, that's what we're talking about. Most indigenous communities and tribes within this area really tended to hug the water. They tended to be close to water bodies for reasons we'll talk about in just a moment. So if you look at this like Google GIS map here of the Puget Sound, what you can see is that this area is defined by water. This area is defined by water. And the reason I'm bringing this, and it's salt water, but also fresh water, lakes and rivers. But whatever it is, water defines the geography of this area. It's very important for you to understand, because the way of life, the cultural customs, the economic systems that emerge in this area are predicated on the water itself. So you really need to keep that geographic reality in mind when you're thinking about these peoples. What you can see here are some images of this area, right? You can see forests and water and islands that are heavily forested. Even to this day, if you go over to these areas, you find areas that are heavily forested, right? But because of modern economic industries like logging and the growth of towns, which encourage the cutting down of trees, there are fewer forests in this environment than there were. But even still today, there's thick forests. But before modern economic and urban development, this area was covered in old growth forests and cedar trees and firs and pines, but also deciduous trees. And that, in addition to that, there was hills and the mountain ranges. What that meant is that communities of people tended to have to congregate along the water, whether it was riverbanks or lake shores or coastal shorelines. And so this environment encouraged a way of life predicated on the sea, on fishing, on whaling, on the gathering of shellfish like clams and mussels and oysters, the sort of like taking advantage of the vegetation and the forests for your housing and clothing, and also for food. And this is a very rich environment. In fact, it's rich, so rich that it actually produced a society that was incredibly unique in world history, as we'll talk about in just a moment. So I just want you to keep these geographic realities in your mind because they are very, very important. So before we move on from the geography to talking about the coastal culture, its society, and some of the very specifics about it, and then maybe talk about a few modern tribes, we need to get some more terminologies and concepts out of the way. For the most part, when you're talking about indigenous peoples and cultures across North America, these peoples were all organized into the same kind of political units. And so we need to be familiar with these terms. So, in the broadest level possible, all indigenous peoples in North America were tribal peoples, meaning they belonged to a tribe. So it's important that we have kind of a colloquial, basic, common understanding of what a tribe is. So broadly speaking, a tribe is a group of people that speak a similar language or an identical language. And they share a common culture, and they recognize one another as belonging to the same people. Now, that last part is really important. There are lots of indigenous peoples across North America who spoke similar languages. Famously, the Navajo and the Apache in the Southwest spoke very similar languages that were mutually intelligible, or mutually intelligible is just a fancy way of saying understandable by one another. But the Navajo and the Apache did not see themselves as the same tribe, as the same people, and therefore they were different and distinct. This acceptance of one another as part of the group identity is really important for a tribe. So it's really important that you understand that. Now, the tribe was the basic, broadest unit of identification. However, in many indigenous peoples in North America, tribes were subdivided into other groups. One of those groups was the band. So tribes could be divided into bands. And a band was a unit of political organization used by some tribes, but not all of them. So what happens is usually, typically, a tribe would have a distinct geographic area it lived in. But sometimes that area will be divided up into groups groups of people who are part of a band. So a band of a particular tribe. They're all the same tribal people, but subdivided into bands. Not all tribes have this. In fact, the coastal peoples that we are talking about in this particular lecture did not have bands traditionally. Traditionally, they did not have bands as a subdividing political unit. However, the plateau peoples, the people we'll talk about in the next unit, they did. But it's something to keep in mind. Now, not every tribe had bands, but most tribes had villages. And villages, in many ways, is the basic political unit of organization utilized by all native peoples. They lived in villages. Now, sometimes those villages were permanent, sedentary villages. That's how they were among coastal communities. Or sometimes they were, temporary seasonal villages where people lived during a particular season, like among the plateau peoples. But you certainly had villages. Now, larger tribes had multiple villages. Smaller tribes just had one village or one seasonal village per place. So most tribes subdivide their land into a village or multiple villages, but they were all started with the same tribe. Now, in some groups, like the plateau, you would have the band as kind of an intermediary organizational unit there. Not in the coastal Indian. So we will not be talking about bands beyond this basic conversation of definitions in this particular unit or lecture, but I want you to be aware of it. So, tribes, band, villages. For the coastal Indians, they have the tribe has land, and that land is divided into multiple villages in most cases. Some of the smaller tribes just had a village, but that's kind of how it worked. In the plateau groups that we'll talk about in the next lecture, tribe, band, village is the preferred structure. Now, the basic term for a political leader among indigenous peoples is chief. Now, that's a term that non-indigenous peoples use that's kind of been adopted by indigenous peoples today. But it was basically a word that we had to have a word to describe the person who led a tribe, okay, or led a village. So, chief is a term for an Indian leader, but the important thing here to remember is the powers and status of a chief varies widely depending on the culture, region, tribe, and traditions that we're talking about. So, you'll hear in this class the term chief applied to people, Chief Joseph, Chief Moses, so on and so forth. However, it's very important to remember that the term chief really, what it means within a tribe itself varies widely depending on what tribe and region you're talking about. In some places, a chief functions like a monarch, right? Like a king or a queen. They have that kind of autocratic power, that ability to dictate law and decisions to their people. In other tribes, a chief is just a recognized leader. They're a first among equals. Because they are chief, their words are given weight, but in general, they can't force or compel anyone to do anything. They have no power of compulsion. They don't have the power to force, compel, or require anything of a member of a village, a band, or a tribe. Also, some tribes will have multiple chiefs. So, for instance, a tribe that has multiple villages, well, every village will have a chief. Sometimes a village will have multiple chiefs. And then, of course, within the tribe, that means there's multiple chiefs, but not all chiefs are equal within the tribe. And then if you have the band, there are village chiefs and band chiefs and tribal chiefs, and sometimes those are exchangeable and interchangeable terms, and sometimes they're not. It really depends on what group we're talking about. And so it's really important as we move our discussions forward that we understand the context in which these terms are used. I will remind you throughout this class, but just keep in mind, if I'm using a chief with respect to one group, it may mean something different than using it with respect to a different group. Native peoples were incredibly diverse in their cultural practices and in their cultural understandings. And even though in introductory courses like this class, we're going to do a lot of generalizing, and we're going to do a lot of like broadly speaking about certain things, it's important to understand that there's always much more nuance and diversity and context to fully understand peoples and their perspectives. And that's just my little introduction to that, okay? So, in a moment, I'll define what a chief is in a coastal context, but just keep in mind that term can vary. All right, now that we understand the basic terminology and concepts that we use when talking about indigenous cultures, let's start exploring the coastal peoples in more depth. Before we do that, actually, we need to talk a little bit about Indian spirituality. Once again, this is a broad discussion that applies to all indigenous peoples in North America. We'll apply it more specifically to coastal peoples in just a moment, but this is a very, very broad conversation, and I just want to make sure that we're having it now, so we're prepared for conversation a little bit earlier. Broadly speaking, Indian spirituality believes in an extensive spiritual world, a world in which everything has a spirit. The word we use here is spirit because it's often hard to capture in one language the concepts of another language, right? You've heard me mention in a previous lecture my love of language, and I have a real love of language, right? You know, I know several languages, and I can tell you, as someone who knows several languages, that it's often very difficult to translate the concept from one translate a concept embedded in a word in one language to another language. And so when we talk about how Native peoples understand the world, we often use the English term spirit, that there's an extensive spiritual world that Native peoples appreciate and understand and respect. The idea that everything is embedded with a particular spirit, humans, animals, plants, the earth itself, objects that we wouldn't even consider animate in our cultural context, like rocks and mountains, have spirit to Native Americans. But keep in mind, I don't want you to, the word spirit has limitations. You know, many people equate it with like a soul or something like that. And it certainly has aspects of that, but it's also a kind of energy, like a kind of spiritual energy or life energy that radiates out from the natural world and everything that is in it. And that's very important for Native peoples. Native peoples believe that the world is buzzing with spiritual energy and that an effective life is about negotiating that spiritual energy, working with it in concert, in harmony with it, or if you have to work against it, understanding the terms of working against that spiritual energy. Also, the world is multidimensional, right? That the world that we live in is filled with dimensions, different levels of existence, of which humans is just one component to it. And this multidimensional, very complex spiritual perspective that indigenous peoples have, it constantly is interacting with the human world. Native peoples don't see, traditionally, a separation between the spiritual and the secular, like we might in our modern world, right? In the modern world, we might think of like, well, you know, I live in my home, I go to work, And then, on Sunday I go to church, or Friday at sundown is Shabbat, and on Saturday I attend shul or synagogue, or I attend Friday evening prayers, or I celebrate holy days at the temple, for Hindu festivals, or so on and so forth, right? In our modern world, we tend to see distinctions between when we do religion and when we do our daily lives. And I do understand that that's a very simplistic, facile kind of explanation of it. And I understand that within both Western and Eastern religious traditions, that's not entirely true. I fully appreciate that. I have a background in religious history, so I'm fully appreciative of that. But for most people in the Western world, at least, right, we tend to see religion as a private matter and related to holidays and feasts and festivals or specific locations like synagogue or temple or a mosque or church or so on and so forth, right? In the traditional indigenous imagination and cultural construct, spirituality was an everyday thing, that your entire life was a spiritual exercise, that to be successful in life is to be spiritually important, and is to be spiritually aware, is to interact successfully with the spiritual world and dimensional world that I described before, right? And so, like, if you want to be a successful hunter, right, you aren't conquering the animals you hunt, you're working in conjunction with, in harmony with the spirits of those animals who are letting you succeed. So a successful whale hunt for a coastal community isn't I, the mighty hunter, killed the whale. It's that the spirit of the whale came to me and allowed itself to be used for our sustenance. Or the spirit of the deer came to me and allowed itself to be used for the sustenance. It's not an adversarial relationship, it's a cooperative one. It's built upon reciprocity. What that means is that you have to have a profound respect for those animals, for those aspects of nature that allow you to live and succeed. You also have to have a profound respect for your ancestors, because their belief in the afterlife is that there's a world of the dead, a world of the ancestors that is just another dimension to this world. Everything's infused with spirituality, and you have to negotiate that. And you negotiate it not necessarily by conquest, but by prayer, by asking, by harmony and reciprocity. Native peoples universally across North America believed very firmly of the earth as their literal mother. They all have origin stories that say they were born from the earth in which they lived. And so literally they came from the earth. The earth was not just a figurative spiritual mother, but a literal mother, and a highly important one. And when you have a view of the world that is imbued with such spiritual energy, and you see the earth as your literal mother, that complicates how you understand land ownership. In the West, land ownership is a really important cultural construct in the sense that we tend to see it politically, economically, and socially, right? Land ownership is important for socioeconomic status. At various times in history, it's been important for political status and political rights and political power. But whatever the case is, we see it in political, social, and economic terms. It generates wealth, it creates stability, it creates family. There are multiple layers to it, but land is part of that, and rooted in that is the idea that you can own, buy, sell land. Native peoples don't understand land that way. They don't understand how they can own their own mother. They don't understand how they can own the spirits that make their life possible. That's sacrilegious to them. And so when we get to the point where, People from Europe and the United States are coming out and they're wanting to settle on land, and they're wanting to establish ownership. They're wanting to buy and sell land, and they're wanting to negotiate with native peoples over land. Not only are there political and power dynamics at play here, not only are we talking about imperialism and colonialism and expansion, we're also talking about ideas that deeply violate indigenous peoples' worldview, that deeply offend them on a cultural and spiritual level. So, daily life is a spiritual existence. The land, the animals, the plants all have a kind of spiritual sacredness that is important to daily life. And therefore, people themselves are often understood in very, very spiritual terms. What I mean by that is that native peoples tend to understand themselves, right, as spiritual beings. And so if you're a successful hunter or you're considered wise, those aren't necessarily just individual skills that you have, individual attributes, individual talents that you have. They are, in fact, a reflection of your spiritual strength. Right? To be a wise chief is not just a political statement, it's a spiritual statement. Chiefs in native traditions were often respected not just for their spiritual, or not just their sort of like individual talents and skills, but what those things said about their spiritual status. We often use the term shaman to describe spiritual leaders in native communities. And oftentimes that shaman might be a chief, but they might also not be a chief, but they're considered something who is, perceived to have a special connection to the earth and the spirits and the spiritual world. And please understand, these concepts can be gendered within native communities because native communities, by and large, were patriarchal, meaning they were male dominated. There were some matriarchal societies among North American indigenous peoples, but for the most part, most of them were patriarchal, and therefore a lot of this stuff can be very gendered and associated with constructs of maleness and constructs of femaleness. But overall, spirituality was quite leveling. Men and women, regardless of gender constructs within a tribe, were often seen as equal participants in this kind of spiritual world. So before we move on, we've now broadly described the basic political terminology that we'll be using when talking about all indigenous peoples in the Pacific Northwest, regardless of whether they're coastal or plateau. And we've talked about the basic spiritual world that both groups inhabit. Now it's time to move on to some more specifics and specificity with respect to coastal communities. So let's start with coastal politics and political organization. The coastal Indians were organized into tribes. Smaller tribes were just the tribe and the village. Larger tribes had multiple villages, each with their own chief, but some chiefs were considered politically more important than others, okay? Within a tribe, if there were multiple villages, the villages appear to have been largely autonomous. I guess I should speak before getting deeper into this about how we know what we know. What I'm trying to describe to you in this lecture and the next is what scholars and academics call pre-Columbia Northwest history. And pre-Columbia just means before Columbus, before European contact. It means we're trying to understand these groups and these tribes before they were transformed by contact with Europe and later the United States. And that task is very, very difficult because in North America, none of these tribal groups developed written none of these groups developed written systems, writing systems. There's no writing here. So then how are we reconstructing this? Well, some of it is archaeology. Some of it are oral traditions, so stories that were passed down generation through generation through generation. Now, oral traditions are very useful because they often preserve a lot of really important historical information. Oral traditions are also problematic because as stories get told over the generations, they often change and transform. And in doing so, you get valuable information, but you're also losing some of the original information. And it gets challenging to tell what's been changed and what hasn't been changed. Sometimes it's obvious, but sometimes it's not so much. So oral traditions are useful, but they're also problematic. The other source we often use are the diaries, journals, and writings of explorers, some of the first Europeans to encounter these groups. So they're encountering them, but in encountering them, right, they're describing what they see, and they haven't been with the tribes long enough to alter or change their original culture. And so some of you might be thinking, well, this could be really useful because these tribes, right, or excuse me, these explorers' accounts of these tribes might provide very accurate information about what they were like before heavier, more sustained contact, trade, etc., etc. And while there's certainly some truth to that, the problem with these explorers' accounts is they're often very, very biased. They're very, very biased against Native peoples. They're often don't understand what it is they are seeing. They often couldn't speak the languages of these indigenous people, so they couldn't communicate to ask questions, so they simply made assumptions when they described things. Some Europeans, for their own reason, just flat out lied about indigenous peoples. And so even the explorers' accounts have to be looked at critically and cannot be accepted as simply fact. So historians have had historians of indigenous North American tribal groups, they have some challenges with the source material. But using those sources, archaeology, oral tradition, and early accounts from outsiders like European explorers and missionaries, there are some really concrete things that they can say about these cultures in their earliest forms. So that's where this information comes from. So one thing you need to know about coastal Indians is they had an abundance of resources. Their land was rich in resources. And because of that, they could live in sedentary villages. Sedentary means the villages didn't change. They had so much food that they could be hunter-gatherers, but not move. That is remarkable and almost unique among the peoples of the world. Let me explain what I mean by that. Traditionally, hunter-gatherers, people who hunt their food and gather their food, they are required to be at the very least semi-nomadic, to occupy a territory and move seasonally throughout that territory in order to acquire the food and resources necessary to survive. And that's because they need to follow the herds. They need to gather at certain times to take advantage of certain resources. Those things are really, really important. They need to do those things at certain times. And they need to do that because the resources are limited in any given area of their territory. So they have to move to take advantage of what resources exist in the totality of their territory. The coastal Indians didn't do that. They had such abundance of resources they could be sedentary. something that is traditionally associated with agricultural communities. And that has profound consequences on their culture. These are among the richest peoples in North America. They were the richest people in terms of abundance of food, abundance of resources, and material culture. It's something that is truly remarkable. It also means that they require smaller amounts of territory. If you were to look at a map of the tribal communities of the Pacific Northwest before before the treaty and reservation system, you would notice that there's numerous coastal tribes, and they all seem to occupy very small amounts of land compared to what you might see in the eastern part of the Pacific Northwest, east of the Cascade Mountains, where you find the plateau groups. Well, the reason for that, of course, is that the plateau groups needed large territories to make their living. The coastal groups did not. So, within the coastal tribes, which just have the tribe and village construct, every village has a chief. In most coastal tribes, chiefs were male and they were hereditary. So they functioned a little bit like monarchs or kings and queens or emperors in a European system. So chiefs were male, and one of their sons was going to inherit the position. It was an inherited position for the most part in most tribes. And these chiefs had vast political and legal powers. These chiefs had the largest amount of land that they had. They didn't own it, but it was their land to gather in, their land to hunt in, their land to fish in, right? And they had tremendous amounts of wealth. The chief was always the wealthiest person in the village. And they had vast legal powers. They could, and political powers. They could effectively dictate the course of the village. They decided matters of law and order. They resolved conflicts, right? They led people into war against their neighbors if they thought it was necessary. They held slaves. They functioned in ways that were very much like a European monarch. Okay? They also had multiple wives, or a wife and multiple concubines. So they were very different than the chiefs you're going to find in the plateau Indians. Now, every village had a chief. If a tribe had multiple villages, every village would have a chief, and therefore tribes had multiple chiefs. But the thing you need to be aware of is not all chiefs were equal within a tribe that had multiple chiefs, and usually one chief was kind of recognized as sort of the high chief or the head chief or the most powerful chief in a tribe that had multiple chiefs. Now that we've kind of given a broad sense of the political understandings of coastal tribes, let's talk about their society. It's important to understand the definition of a society. Society is just kind of like the way humans organize themselves and their relationships to one another. Societies can either be sort of egalitarian and loose, or they can be quite stratified and rigid. When we say egalitarian and loose, what we mean is that there aren't really large social distinctions between people, that people are generally seen as socially equal to one another, right? Whereas in a more rigid, hierarchical society, there are rigid class structures. And coastal society actually had quite a rigid class structure with very defined social classes that appear to have been determined by birth. And as I said, coastal society was fairly patriarchal. It's fairly male-dominated. So within the coastal tribes, remember there's lots of different and distinct tribes, within them, they had basically the same four social classes. One were the chiefs. They're the most powerful and the wealthiest members. They and their family. You had nobles. And nobles were like an elite. Among the men, they were the hunters and the warriors. Among the women, they were elite women who might have a spiritual role or who had prime positions within the villages, right? And they had, very lives of leisure, if you will. Now, with respect to access to resources, chiefs had the best fishing, gathering, and hunting grounds within a village or a tribe's territory. The second best belonged to like the nobles, the elite families. They had the next best access to hunting, fishing, and gathering grounds. Below the nobles were the commoners. The commoners were dependent upon chiefs and nobles for their existence. They didn't really have access to fishing and gathering and hunting grounds on their own. They were dependent upon them. They were dependent on nobles and commoners to give them those things. And so what happened was is that they would perform tasks for those people, for the higher social classes. They might be craftsmen and tool makers, or they would gather like the food, or and acquire it, or prepare it, or preserve it, or make clothing, whatever it is. They worked in exchange for access to the resources for their own survival provided by the upper classes. And then there was slavery. Too often, when the word slavery is thrown about in the United States, most people's impressions of it are, the kind of like slavery you found in the American South before the Civil War. That's immediately most people in the United States' recollection of slavery. And that's not the kind of slavery we're talking about here. Slaves had slavery existed all throughout the world, all throughout world history. And slavery is different in every cultural context that you find it in. In the context of coastal society, slaves were very, very valuable commodities, an important part of the social and political system. Owning slaves created status. Entire wars were fought among tribes in the Northwest Coast for slaves. A person who owned more slaves was higher status. A tribe that owned more slaves was considered powerful and more intimidating. With respect to the Pacific Northwest, the most powerful coastal tribes were actually found further north in British Columbia and Alaska. And they often came down and made slave raids on the tribes of Washington and Oregon to prove dominance and power. That said, the tribes of Washington and Oregon still had slaves, but they tended to be less powerful compared to their more northern neighbors. But slave raids were an important part of this society. They were a common feature. Warfare was common, not necessarily over resources and hunting and fishing grounds, although that did happen, but simply slave raids to prove dominance and to demonstrate the wealth and power of other tribes. So this is an important part of their culture. Slaves were utterly dependent. Slaves they belonged to someone. They belonged to a noble. They belonged to a chief. They weren't necessarily thought of as personal property in the same way that black slaves were thought of in the American South prior to the Civil War. So it wasn't exactly that kind of construct, but nonetheless, it's important to understand that they were controlled and owned by chiefs and commoners. Okay. Now, there is some evidence that slaves were dependent. Right. Now, some slaves were taken because, like a village might be raided for slaves because the village had noted craftsmen and artists, or, tool makers or canoe makers or something like that. And you wanted them. So you captured them, you made them slaves, but actually they had a quite comfortable living because you wanted them to produce these wonderful works for you. So you treated them quite well, despite the fact that they were still slaves. But then there's also evidence that slaves could be treated very, very poorly, and there's some evidence that slaves might be killed in a kind of sacrificial manner. Um, to as when a chief died, to go along with the burial. Now, before you know, you take that as absolute truth, you need to understand that Native peoples in coastal communities reject that notion of a kind of quasi-human sacrifice of slaves. But it is something that a few of the European explorers and missionaries wrote about, and some archaeologists say there's evidence for it. But it is a contentious claim. I'm not enough of an expert to know what to make of it. And keep in mind what I said earlier. European and American missionaries and explorers cannot be counted on as objective observers of indigenous cultures, that there are clear biases in their writings that really call into question the accuracy of their observations. So this is, a controversial claim, but many well-respected scholars of indigenous cultures and peoples, particularly of the Northwest, do claim that do believe that the evidence suggests that this is something that happened. So I mention it, but I don't have enough expertise in this area to come down one way or another on the claim. So I want you to know that there was another view or perspective on it. Because coastal culture was sedentary and had an abundance of resources, it is perhaps the wealthiest indigenous culture in all of North America. And they were noted for having lots of material objects, but objects that were created with high craftsmanship and artistic quality. So for instance, they had masks. Lots of indigenous peoples had masks that they used in their ceremonies, but the coastal communities had the most ornate masks, as you can see here. Like there's an example of a Makah mask, and the Makah are a tribe that's found on the Olympic Peninsula, on the very northwest tip of the Olympic Peninsula today. And so, you just see these heavily crafted, like canoes. Lots of people make canoes, but the coastal communities heavily decorated and crafted them. Why? Because they could. Because they had the resources to do so. Because they didn't need to direct all their labor towards hunting and gathering, that they had such an abundance, the decorated surplus, so you could afford to have people who dedicated their lives just to making masks, or making elaborate canoes, or making elaborate oars, or clothing, because their labor wasn't needed just to gather, hunt, acquire food and resources, that there was enough food available that they could effectively be given food in exchange for their labor. And so you just see on these slides the ornateness of coastal culture, the magnificence of their artistic creations, right? It's not just what they made, their technology. They had very similar technology to what everyone else had, but they just made it with such quality and artistic flair because they had the resources to do so. Right? You can see some clothing. Like the basic clothing that the coastal culture people used was cedar bark clothing. And in this historic photo here, you can see images of cedar bark clothing. And so basically it is what it is. They take the bark of the cedar tree and wind it together. Why? It's a very wet environment, but cedar is water resistant. So it was like having a raincoat. You wouldn't get wet or damp. But on the left, you can see an image of what the clothing could look like for a high-ranking member of society, where underneath they would have the cedar bark clothing, but then on top they'd have elaborately dyed and decorated furs and hats and various cultural objects, because they, it was a possibility. You had the abundance of resources to support that kind of artistic craftsmanship. The coastal Indians are most famous for something called, or one of their most famous cultural objects is something called a totem pole. Now, totem poles are something that other indigenous peoples across North America have adopted, but initially it was unique to the Northwest Coast Indians, or the coastal Indians. Now, totem poles are commonly misunderstood. Most people think that they're kind of like religious objects, like some sort of like religious idol, or maybe like a crucifix that you might find in a church, or a tabernacle with like the Torah that you might find in a Jewish synagogue, right? That it might be that it's something like that, and that is a bit of a misunderstanding of what a totem pole is. It certainly is sacred because in indigenous concept, right, um, uh, uh, everything has spiritual value. But what a totem pole really is an expression of a family. It's much more equivalent to like a European coat of arms. You know, like if you're familiar with sort of medieval and Renaissance Europe, right? All the aristocratic families had coat of arms, symbols that represented the family. They got put on clothing or shields or armor or banners or whatnot, depending on the context and the era. And these images were all symbolically important to the family itself, from noble families all the way up to monarchs and kings. So, you know, that's kind of what a totem pole is. It's a unique series of images that reflect the history, heritage, and spirituality of the family, right? And so each of these images is really important. Actually, the lower the image, the more important it is. So, you know, we have a saying today like I'm the low person on the totem pole, as because that's, you know, like somehow that's the worst position. But actually, the most sacred objects are on the bottom, and they're still sacred, but they're less sacred as you work your way up. But a totem pole is carved of wood. It's ornately sort of designed. It's ornately painted. It's a reflection of the family. And these things were huge and expensive undertakings. Noble families and the families of chiefs would create these in secret, and they would have craftsmen, sometimes slaves that they had captured specifically for this purpose, to craft these in secret, sometimes for months, sometimes for years. And when the totem pole was done, it would be revealed publicly in a ceremony and raised. And wealthy, you know, most coastal villages had multiple totem poles, but the wealthier the village, the much more abundance of totem poles that you would find. And so these highly respected craftsmen would spend a long time on them. When they were revealed, there would be celebration, there would be, you know, festivals and rituals and ceremonies, games. Games were a really important part of Native culture, right? That were both for fun and entertainment, but also had a spiritual component. And the raising of these required a spiritual ceremony because of their significance, but they much more reflected wealthy families. And the more totem poles you had in a village, the more ornately designed they were, the more you could tell the wealth of a village. Whaling was also an important part of many coastal tribes. Now, not all. And I should say that you have to understand something. There were some coastal tribes that lived further inland along lakes and waterways. And their culture sometimes more resembled the plateau culture of eastern Washington and Oregon and British Columbia, or they had to make adaptations from those communities that lived right directly on the ocean or the Puget Sound, or, you know, the saltwater bodies. So, like I said, I'm really speaking in broad strokes here when I'm talking about the quote unquote coastal Indians. But those who lived like on the Puget Sound and along the Pacific Ocean and along the Straits of Juan de Fuca, they were famous for their whaling. Whaling was an important part of their culture. And it remains so to this day. Now, it is controversial because, you know, whale populations are in decline around the world, and many environmental activists and animal rights activists believe that whaling should be stopped regardless of its cultural significance. Indigenous peoples, like in Washington, the Makah are the most famous example, but there are other groups. They believe whaling is their right as indigenous peoples, and guaranteed under treaties and guaranteed under law, and they're going to do it. And so today it is the grounds for conflict, but within the context of you know, the pre-Columbia, and then later Pacific Northwest history, it was an important part of their culture, and it was imbued with religious significance, like all aspects of Native culture is. And you can see some images on the slide here of whaling techniques, and then you can see some images of villages of people heading out to whale. One thing I want to mention is a unique cultural celebration that was specific and unique to coastal Indians. And that's called the potlatch, right? And the potlatch was a celebration in which a village chief or a village noble, but usually a village chief, would invite other local villages to a religious celebration that would last for numerous days. A potlatch could be called for anything. It could be called for whaling. It could be called to celebrate the first, sort of like gathering of the salmon, or for significant moments in someone's life, for a successful slave raid. There are any number of reasons you could have a potlatch. But once you had it, it involved the giving away of wealth, right? These were events that were spiritually important that lasted for days, but they were also events of conspicuous consumption. At a potlatch, the person throwing it would be giving away all of their objects, all of their food, all their clothing, all their tools, all their artwork. With the exception of like a totem pole, they would be giving everything away. And they would do so over days. And it was intended to be a demonstration of the wealth and power of an individual, specifically a chief or of a tribe or of a village, right? It was a sign of the material, cultural, and economic wealth of the coastal Indians. It involved dancing and storytelling and food and games and all these kinds of things. So there's a very celebratory attitude to it. But there was also a political and social message there. And that message was this: I have so much wealth, I can give it all away, and within the coming days, have it back. It's the kind of conspicuous consumption that no other native peoples in North America could ever have afforded to do, because they didn't have those kinds of resources. And so it's only here that you find this particular cultural celebration. All right. That is a very general overview of Northwest Coast or coastal Indian culture. Keep in mind, within that, there's lots of variety and diversity, because within that, there are hundreds of tribes, each with their own unique language and cultures. I'm not intending this to be an exhaustive, authoritative overview. What it is to set the stage for further, more specific conversations. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the other culture group that you find in the Pacific Northwest, the Plateau Indians. But that's for next time. All right, I thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.